Ever witnessed a situation where someone judged too quickly and lived to regret it? What happens when the person they underestimated turns out to be the one in charge? Let us know in the comments below, but first, let's dive into this unbelievable moment of reckoning. The courthouse was always loud in the mornings. Phones ringing, hurried footsteps echoing off marble floors, and the endless chatter of attorneys, defendants, and clerks moving through the halls. Derrick Lewis had been working security here for 10 years, and at this point the chaos didn't faze him. He knew the rhythm, the way things moved, the way people moved. He also knew who belonged and who didn't. Or at least, he thought he did. "Hey, Lewis," Officer Raymond Hale called out, nudging Derrick as they stood by the security checkpoint. "You see her?" Derrick followed Hale's gaze across the lobby to a woman standing near one of the elevators. She was black, mid to late 30s, dressed sharp black blazer, fitted pants, polished heels. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, but there was something in the way she scanned the walls, like she was looking for something, or lost. Derrick frowned. "Yeah, what about her?" "She's been standing there for 5 minutes, Hale muttered. "Ain't asked nobody for help, ain't checked in at the desk, just looking around like she's casing the place." Derrick shifted his stance, watching the woman a little more closely. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but Hale was already on edge, and Derrick had learned that when Hale got that look in his eye, things could escalate fast. "Could be a lawyer," Derrick offered. Hale scoffed. "That ain't no lawyer." Derrick sighed. "Here we go." "All right, let's go find out," Hale said, already making his way toward the woman. Derrick followed, keeping his expression neutral. This wasn't his first time watching Hale make a scene over nothing, and he had long since learned that pushing back in the moment never helped. Hale didn't listen. He never did. As they approached, the woman noticed them, her sharp brown eyes flicking up from the directory on the wall. "Ma'am," Hale said, his voice just a little too forceful. "You lost?" The woman turned fully to face them, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" Hale folded his arms over his chest. "I said, are you lost? You've been standing here a while looking around. If you have business in this courthouse, you need to check in at the front desk." Derrick stayed quiet, watching the woman's reaction. She didn't look nervous, didn't look defensive. She just stared at Hale like he was something on the bottom of her shoe. "And if I don't?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Hale's eyes narrowed. "Then we're gonna have a problem." Derrick sighed internally. That was the thing about Hale. He was always looking for a problem, always trying to exert control where it wasn't needed. And Derrick? He had made it a habit of letting him. Not because he agreed, but because it was easier. "Sir," the woman said, her voice cool, controlled. "I'm standing in a public building. I don't have to explain myself to you." Hale's jaw tensed. Derrick could already see the way this was going. "Listen, lady." "My name is not Lady," she cut in. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd lower your tone." The whole lobby seemed to go quiet for a second. A couple of people had stopped to watch. Court employees, attorneys, a bailiff near the doors. Hale's grip tightened on his belt. "Lower my tone?" he repeated, a slow smirk curling on his lips. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think this is, but you don't get to walk in here and start giving orders." The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh? But you do?" Hale took a step closer, and for the first time, Derrick moved. "Hale," he murmured, a warning. Hale ignored him. Derrick looked at the woman again, trying to make sense of her. She wasn't backing down, wasn't afraid. That wasn't how people usually reacted to Hale's intimidation tactics. Either they cowered or they got angry. But she was simply waiting. "You're going to have to come with us," Hale finally said, reaching for his radio. Derrick felt his stomach drop. The woman exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "And what exactly am I being detained for?" "You're acting suspicious." "Suspicious," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You're loitering in a secured area, you haven't presented identification, and you've refused to state your business." Derrick's stomach twisted. He'd heard this script before. It never ended well. Then, before Hale could say another word, a panicked voice cut through the tension. "Judge Carter." A court clerk came rushing through the lobby, wide-eyed. She nearly tripped over her own feet before stopping just short of the woman. "Your courtroom is ready," the clerk said breathlessly. "Sorry for the delay, ma'am." Silence. A heavy, sinking silence. Derrick's throat went dry. Hale's smirk disappeared. The woman Judge Carter straightened her blazer. She didn't even look at Hale. "I see," she murmured, eyes locking on to Derrick instead. "Thank you." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Nobody spoke. Derrick stood frozen, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Hale, still looking dumbstruck, swallowed hard. She's a judge?" Derrick didn't answer. His face burned with something deeper than embarrassment. Judge Carter didn't need to say anything else. Her silence had said enough. And for the first time in 10 years, Derrick wondered if keeping quiet had ever truly made things easier. The courthouse lobby was still. Derrick could feel the weight of 100 silent stares pressing down on him, on Hale, on the moment they had just lived through. Judge Carter's footsteps echoed as she walked away, her back straight, her head high. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Hale's mouth was slightly open, like his brain hadn't fully caught up yet. He ran a hand over his buzzed blonde hair, his skin pale beneath the fluorescent lights. She's a judge?" he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Derrick didn't answer. His throat felt tight. It had happened. That moment. The one where everything shifts, where the ground under your feet crumbles just enough to make you stumble. He had stood there and let it happen. No, he had helped make it happen. Hale, still processing, let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Man, damn. I did not see that coming." Derrick shot him a look, but Hale wasn't paying attention. He was too busy forcing out another laugh, shaking his head like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't that big of a deal. It was. People were still watching. A few clerks whispered behind cupped hands. A bailiff in the corner gave them a long, pointed look before walking off. Even the woman at the front desk had that expression, the one that said, "That was bad, real bad." Derrick exhaled sharply through his nose. "We should get back to work." "Yeah," Hale muttered, clearing his throat and straightening his belt. "Yeah, let's just forget that happened." But Derrick couldn't. The rest of the morning dragged, each second heavier than the last. Derrick found himself watching the elevator Judge Carter had disappeared into, his stomach twisting every time the doors dinged open. What if she came back? What if she reported them? He had dealt with complaints before, but this was different. This was power. He had watched judges stroll through these halls for years, most of them older white men who barely noticed him. But Carter? She had seen him. And she had let him see her. That made it worse. By lunch, Derrick couldn't take it anymore. He needed to move, needed air. He stepped outside into the courthouse courtyard, the sun warm against his skin. He barely had a second to breathe before a voice cut through the open space. "You got a minute?" Derrick turned. "Judge Carter." She stood by one of the stone benches, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The crisp autumn air played with the loose curls at the edges of her dark hair, but her stance remained firm. Derrick swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew better than to run. "Yes, ma'am," he said, straightening his shoulders. She nodded once, then turned, walking toward a quieter part of the courtyard. Derrick followed, his pulse thrumming beneath his skin. When they stopped, she didn't speak right away. Instead, she studied him, eyes searching, weighing something. Finally, she asked, "How long have you worked here?" 10 years. Derrick said, His voice was steady, but his fingers curled slightly at his sides. 10 years? She repeated, her tone laced with something unreadable. So you know how things work around here. Derrick nodded. You knew he was wrong, she said, and it wasn't a question. Derrick felt the weight of those words settle in his gut. He could have lied, could have made excuses, but what would be the point? She already knew. Yes, he admitted. Judge Carter exhaled, shaking her head slightly. Then why didn't you stop him? The words hit harder than he expected. Because it was easier, because he had done it before, because stepping in meant making himself a target, because he had spent years learning how to survive in this job, and sometimes that meant letting people like Hale do what they did. Derrick licked his lips, choosing his words carefully. It's complicated. Carter raised an eyebrow. Is it? Derrick let out a slow breath, looking away. He doesn't listen, he never does. And if I push too hard, I'm the one who gets written up, or worse. Carter studied him for a long moment before nodding, as if she had expected that answer. You ever thought about why that is? Derrick's jaw tensed. He knew. Of course he knew. Because he was a black man in a uniform working for a system that wasn't built for him. Because people like Hale could make mistakes and laugh them off. But he had to be careful. Because if Derrick had been the one questioning her, things might have played out differently. And yet, he had still let it happen. I see men like you all the time, Carter continued, voice steady. Good men. Men who don't want to rock the boat because they know the boat ain't built for them, and I get it. But let me ask you something, Officer Lewis. When that moment came, when you saw what was happening, did it sit right with you? Derrick didn't answer. He didn't need to. Carter sighed, shaking her head. I'm not here to punish you. That's not my job. But I need you to understand something. This courthouse, it's bigger than you. It's bigger than Hale. It's bigger than me. And if people like us don't speak up when we see things like that, then what the hell are we doing here? Derrick's throat felt tight.
She wasn't yelling, wasn't scolding, but somehow that made it worse. Because she was right. And she's giving him the chance to be right, too. Carter glanced at her watch. I have a hearing in 10 minutes, she said. But I'll tell you this, Officer Lewis. You get to choose what kind of man you want to be in this place. You get to decide whether you're just part of the system or if you're willing to change it. She turned, started walking away. Derrick opened his mouth, then closed it. He had so much he wanted to say. Instead, he asked, "Would you have filed a complaint?" Carter paused, looking back at him.
A slow smile curved her lips. I didn't need to. Derrick frowned. Why? At that moment, the courthouse doors opened, and 2 officers stepped outside. One of them, a supervisor, caught sight of Derrick and nodded for him to come over. Then Derrick saw who they were escorting out. Hale. His face was tight, his lips pressed together in frustration. One of the officers had a clipboard in hand, and Derrick already knew what was happening. Hale had been reported. Not by her, but by someone. Maybe a clerk, maybe an attorney who had been watching. Maybe the woman at the front desk who had seen enough of his behavior over the years. But it had happened.
Carter gave Derrick one last look. The world's always watching, Officer Lewis, she said. The question is, are you? She walked inside, leaving him standing there. For the first time in a long time, Derrick realized he had a choice. And this time he wasn't sure if he could keep looking away.
Derrick stood frozen in the courthouse courtyard, watching as Hale was escorted out through the side entrance, his face tight with barely restrained frustration. It was happening. The thing that never happened. Hale wasn't just getting a slap on the wrist this time. Someone had reported him. Someone had acted. Derrick had seen enough men like Hale skate by untouched, brushing off complaints, turning every accusation into a misunderstanding. But this was different. Hale wasn't walking out of here with his usual smirk. He wasn't laughing it off. Derrick swallowed hard, his throat dry. This should have felt like justice. So why did it feel like a warning? The afternoon passed in a haze. Derrick went through the motions, checking bags at the security line, scanning ID badges, keeping his head down. He could feel the whispers around him, the sidelong glances from clerks and attorneys. He knew what they were thinking. Why didn't he stop it? But nobody said it. Not out loud. By the time his shift was winding down, his body felt heavy. He needed to move, needed to shake off this feeling crawling under his skin. He should have gone home, let the day wash off him. Instead, his feet carried him somewhere else. To Judge Carter's chambers. Her door was cracked open. He knocked anyway. "Come in." Derrick stepped inside.
The office was surprisingly small, just a desk, a few shelves, a window overlooking the city. No grand bookshelf full of law books, no pretentious decor. Just her, sitting at her desk, flipping through a file. She looked up when he entered, her gaze steady. "Officer Lewis." Derrick hesitated, then closed the door behind him. "Judge Carter." She sat back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "What can I do for you?" Derrick exhaled slowly. I I just wanted to talk." Her lips quirked slightly. "That's a first." He let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, I guess it is." Carter nodded, waiting. Derrick shifted his weight, then ran a hand over his face. "He's gone." I know," Carter said simply. Derrick's eyes flickered to her. "Did you report him?" "No," she said. "I didn't have to." Derrick frowned. "Then who?" Carter tilted her head slightly. "Does it matter?" "I shouldn't have." And yet, Derrick found himself grasping for an answer. It's just, things like this don't usually happen. Not to guys like him. Carter's expression didn't change. "You mean white guys like him?"
Derrick stiffened. She didn't say it with judgment, just fact. He let out a slow breath. "Yeah." Carter leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "You want to know why this time was different?" Derrick nodded. "Because enough people saw," she said. "Because enough people were tired of letting it slide. And maybe, just maybe, because men like you are finally starting to ask the right questions." Derrick's jaw tightened. "I've been asking questions for a long time, Judge." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Have you?" Derrick opened his mouth, then stopped. Had he? Sure, he'd thought about it, felt it, the unfairness, the system working exactly how it was designed to, the way he'd had to move differently, act differently, be careful in ways Hale never did. But what had he done about it? Nothing. He had let it happen. Carter sighed, leaning back again. "You think you're the only one who's had to play the game? Do you know how many times I've been mistaken for the court reporter in my own damn courtroom?"
Derrick's gaze snapped to hers. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Too many times to count. And every time, I had a choice. Correct them or let them think what they want. I used to let it go. Used to smile. Used to pretend it didn't bother me. Because it was easier. Because I didn't want to rock the boat." Her eyes darkened slightly. "But you let that go long enough, and one day you wake up and realize you're part of the problem." Derrick looked down, hands on his hips. Carter's voice softened. "You're not a bad man, Officer Lewis." He huffed out a humorless laugh. "Doesn't feel like it today." Carter studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit down." Derrick hesitated. Then he did. She leaned forward. "Tell me something. What do you think happens next?" Derrick frowned. "What do you mean?" With you, she clarified. You stood there today. You watched it happen. You let it happen. I'm not here to drag you for it. You already know what you did. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? Derrick swallowed because that was the question, wasn't it? He could keep his head down, keep playing it safe, keep pretending that silence wasn't just another form of compliance. Or he could do something else. But what did that even look like? Carter must have seen the uncertainty in his eyes because she nodded. I'm not asking you to quit your job. I'm not asking you to put a target on your back. But I am asking you to think about the next time. Derrick met her gaze. The next time you see something like this happening, she said, her voice steady, what will you do? Derrick exhaled through his nose. He knew what she was asking, and he didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted one. He stood, nodding once. I'll figure it out. Ryder smiled, small but approving. Good. Derrick turned to leave, his mind racing. Just as he reached the door, Carter's voice stopped him. "Ooh, and Officer Lewis?" He looked back. She tilted her head. "I expect to see you in my courtroom sometime soon." Derrick raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Her smile widened. "Because I have a feeling that next time you won't be silent." Derrick didn't answer. He didn't need to, because for the first time in his career, he knew she was right.